definitely one of Ukraine's tactics to make the Russians unsettled, to make sure the Russians can't focus their offensive forces. They have to put defenses in place elsewhere. So I think that technique is going to continue. We've seen small raids before this, and maybe the Russians are slightly better defended against it now. But I think the tactic of striking Russia inside Russia will definitely be a key focal point for the Ukrainians as they move forward.
Let's talk a bit about the latest situation on the ground. First of all, in Kursk. I mean, here we are, 2 months or so since Ukraine launched the incursion into Kursk Oblast. How would you assess its success so far?
So Ukraine had initial success, obviously, in surprising the Russians and making a kind of a political message. And I think it should have demonstrated to many in the West that the kind of the red lines that Russia had laid down about no attacks on Russia are a bit of a bluff, and the West probably should have thought harder about being able to allow Ukraine to use its missiles or long-range missiles against Russian targets. That the sovereign, sacred Russian territory argument doesn't seem to hold water. But the Ukrainians did miss an opportunity to cut off a key segment of a Russian force south of the same river. They'd taken out all the bridges along that river, and the Russians have actually been able to reinforce that and are now driving east into Ukraine's flank, which looks like a bit of a problem for the Ukrainians. So while there's still some attempts to advance by Ukrainians, they're not moving a huge amount of territory. The Russians are still in a position to kind of cut off some of the most advanced parties of the Ukrainian offensive. So it is an increasingly difficult situation for the Ukrainians. And in the meantime, the assault against Pokrovsk, which is a really strategic key garrison town in the Donbass, continues. And it's difficult to argue that the Ukrainians have seen their assault in Kursk pay strategic dividends yet.
Just on Pokrovsk, what makes it such a strategic garrison town? Why is it so important?
So if you take Pokrovsk, you've essentially cut off from the south the towns of Konstantinivka, which would then allow you to kind of flank Chasiv Yar, which has been a really good position for the Ukrainians. It's on heights, it's got a canal facing it. They've held the Russians there for months. It's very difficult for the Russians to get across. If you can attack Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka from the south, you can then drive up the road, and you're looking at the Russians taking Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And Kramatorsk, since 2014, had been the headquarters of Ukraine's military in the Donbass, so the key part of Ukraine's military effort in the Donbass. And that would allow Putin to then claim his success in the Donbass. One of the key reasons that he started this full-scale invasion is to take the entire Donbass, the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. And if he's able to take Pokrovsk, that puts him a long way towards doing that. It also puts him on the borders of the Donetsk region, and it gives him an opportunity to drive further towards Dnipro, which is a really important town of 1 million people in Ukraine. It's been a hub for Ukraine's military as well, but a very important part of Ukraine's economy. And so the Ukrainians really do need to hold on to Pokrovsk. It's a really important strategic town, and it's been home to thousands and thousands of soldiers since the war in Donbass began.
And of course, a lot of people think that one of the main objectives of the Kursk incursion was to try and divert troops away from the front line in the east, Russian troops away from the front line in the east, into Kursk to try and relieve the situation there. That doesn't really appear to have happened on any grand scale. As a result, would it be fair to call the Kursk incursion a tactical success, but at the moment, no more?
I think at the moment, they haven't had a great strategic success from that, unless it is about this debate on whether you should allow Ukraine to strike Russian targets with long-range missiles, and whether it demonstrates to the West that those red lines are not real. And I think we did see after the Kursk incursion that debate intensify, and to talk about the use of storm shadows has been a really key debate, but it hasn't paid dividends yet. If it does, then perhaps it will have been a useful thing to do. And there are still things that Ukraine may have up its sleeves. I know some units that were defending Pokrovsk that have been moved to other places that are not they haven't been used again yet, and we don't know where they're going to be used. Is there a trap line for the Russians? We don't know. But the Ukrainians obviously don't disclose their plans in advance. And one of the key reasons the Kursk offensive was initially successful is because they kept it very secret.
Do you think we may see further cross-border raids from Ukraine, even if not necessarily on the scale of the Kursk incursion?
I think it's definitely one of Ukraine's tactics to make the Russians unsettled, to make sure the Russians can't focus their offensive forces. They have to put defenses in place elsewhere. So I think that technique is going to continue. We've seen small raids before this, and maybe the Russians are slightly better defended against it now. But I think the tactic of striking Russia inside Russia will definitely be a key focal point for the Ukrainians as they move forward.
And as someone who's followed the war so closely, Maxim, were you surprised that Ukraine was able to enter Kursk and make such progress and then hold the territory as apparently easily as it has done?
I don't think it's been particularly easy for them to hold the territory, and as soon as they got in, that the Russians maneuvered to try and drive them out. But I think it speaks to the way that Russia has conducted this war and the way that the West has allowed Russia to conduct this war. The Russians thought that they did not need to defend that border properly because the West was never going to support a Ukrainian attack on it, especially with Western weapons, Western equipment, armor, and vehicles. And then the West wouldn't allow the Ukrainians to support it with long-range strike by HIMARS and ATACMS and things like this. So the Russians were surprised, and obviously the only way Ukraine was able to do that is by not asking the West permission. Presumably, if they had, there would have been a heated debate, and that would have been rejected. And we saw some talk of an operation against Russia that was stopped by the US government. We still don't know what exactly that plan was, but the New York Times reported on it. So I think Ukraine will continue to try and push this debate and take matters into its own hands to try and demonstrate that to the Russians that they can't relax anywhere. They have to defend everywhere. And that this is not a war that's going to go away easily, and that Russian society needs to think about whether they want to live with this war for the foreseeable future.
And it was interesting you mentioned a moment ago that potentially one of the successes of the Kursk incursion is proving once and for all that some of these red lines that Putin draws are bluffs, particularly over, if you can physically invade Russian territory and him not reach for the nuclear button, that exposes that as a bluff. And so again, that raises the question of, well, why not give long-range missiles for use on Russian targets such as Storm Shadow, such as Scalp? And we haven't seen the granting of that permission so far. Were they to be granted, how much of a difference would they actually make?
They would make a difference if they were given it in numbers, and production was drastically ramped up. And all these would send signals to the Russians as well that the West is determined to see Ukraine win. The problem that's happened is you have symbolic gestures, like 14 Challenger tanks donated to Ukraine is not going to make a huge difference. It encouraged others to give tanks. All of that was helpful, but unless you give something that makes a strategic difference immediately, you just allow the enemy time to adapt to whatever new kit that you've given it. So 6 F-16s at the beginning is not going to be enough to terrify the Russian Air Force. But if there was suddenly 100 F-16s in the air, that kind of thing would make a difference. And the same thing applies with these missiles. If you had a sudden permission to strike with these missiles, and then the use of these missiles at scale before the Russians were able to do anything about it, then it could have made a difference. Now I think we've already seen the Russians pulling back a lot of their tactical, their strategic equipment as well from the front lines to make sure that they're not within range of those missiles in case they are used. So there's all of this kind of debate. The thing that is an essential part of our democracies is a sense being used as a weakness by the Russians because they can anticipate everything that's coming before it does happen. And the West is so worried about this kind of nuclear button that it's not able to help Ukraine inflict a really decisive strategic blow.
And are there other pieces of kit that at the moment we're not discussing in terms of military aid to Ukraine, but that privately the Ukrainians would want? I mean, I don't know, the American JASSM missiles, for instance. I don't know if that ever gets mentioned, but are there other pieces of kit that maybe in 6 months' time we will be having a public debate about?
I think, the Ukrainians, they want everything. They want it now, understandably. But really the key question is about volume. It's about, it's great to have these advanced pieces of kit, but we need enough of them and we need the ammunition constantly. And the West is always quite surprised at how many missiles the Ukrainians have to use, how much ammunition they have to use, because the West hasn't been involved in a war of this scale for a very long time. And if you're fighting a counterinsurgency, you're not using weapons on this scale. And this is a constant argument that the Ukrainians have to make. I was talking with their defense colonel about the use of Patriot missiles, and he said how he's kept being advised to use less Patriot missiles against cruise missiles coming into the country. But his argument was, well, if I use less, that increase the risk that's going to get through and it's going to hit something important like a thermal power station. So how can I use less of these missiles? And that's, when we saw Ukraine have to ration its equipment with a huge delay in US aid, we saw Russia making advances, being able to destroy most of Ukraine's, or damage at least, most of Ukraine's energy generating capacity. And that's going to cause real problems for as long as this war continues now. So the argument, I think, is remove the restrictions, allow the weapons to be used and to provide them at volume. That would be the most important thing. I mean, obviously, air power is still a critical part of this war, as in any war. And, I think we were kidding ourselves for a long time when we talked about denying Russia the airspace will be more important than giving Ukrainians air superiority. Air superiority is demonstrated by the use of Russian glide bombs to be really, really key in this war. If you can have an effective air attack system, then you are going to inflict really heavy casualties on your enemy. And Ukraine is moving towards doing something about that. I think, the fact that Sweden has donated its own equivalent of AWACS, 2 of them, to Ukraine. We don't know when we'll see them flying over Ukraine yet, but that will suddenly the tables will be turned. The Russian A-50s are no longer flying in Ukraine, will have Swedish AWACS in the air. But you also, of course, you need to have the jets to go alongside that in order for that to produce a difference. And it's still very slow going with the training of F-16 pilots.
And just finally, Maxim, as we approach the Ukrainian winter, are we unlikely to see any major positional breakthroughs from either side over the coming months?
I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, the Pekrov situation looks very precarious, very precarious. The Russians are still advancing towards it. They're moving around it. And that whole salient that they've built in that after taking Avdiivka is significant. And with Ukrainian forces deployed elsewhere to fight the Russians in the Kharkiv region, Kursk region, defending that territory is difficult. If they take Pokrovsk, then it's advancing towards Dnipro is a real possibility, and that is going to be a huge and very difficult battle. So I think it's always possible for the Russians to make a breakthrough. They still have a huge amount of manpower. They still have so much hardware in storage. It might be antiquated. But they also are getting new stuff from Iran. They've got ammunition coming from North Korea. They've kind of got more reliable partners in some respects, although less advanced than Ukraine has. Ukraine has to fight for everything, argue for everything, justify it, and then try and persuade the West that this nuclear threat is not real, and that's very difficult for them.
Maxim Tucker, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.